Welcome to edition of a new program we're going to be running through the community. We're going to call this Community Conversation on Critical Race Theories and Issues. And I have with me Dr. Patrick Velasquez, who I met years ago, well over, I would say 30 years ago. We met in a graduate class at UNO. And one of the things I've asked Dr. Patrick Velasquez to talk about is some of his experiences and some of the things that he's been writing about, and just share a lot related to the Chicano experience and help our communities to understand the importance of understanding critical race theories, but as well as that is understanding some of the issues that we as people of color encounter. And so he has he got his PhD many years ago, I think in San Diego. We were in graduate schools at UNO getting our masters together, and the story goes that we were in education administration. It was an education class that deals with American education. And Dr. Patrick was sitting on one side of the room. He wasn't a doctor then, we're both graduate students. And I noticed he had this tenacity, this kind of a pit bull mentality about taking on racism. And I was on the other side of the room, and I had that same pit bull mentality, even though we don't favor dogs, but we'll just use it as a metaphor here. And then we had this white racist type teacher who was talking about American education, but he didn't mention anything about people of color. And when we got finished with him, he said, all of y'all both do an independent research or something in the class, because he was not equipped to talk about race in that traditional American education. As we moved forward, Patrick and I became great friends, and he became the director of Chicano Awareness Center and very much involved in dealing with racial issues, as well as educational issues with many of the students in the community, and particularly helping to uplift many of the families and so on, and was a strong advocate to help bring our communities together. So in that vein, we got to become great compadres, and we both have a very strong passion about jazz music and you name it, and international issues. The other thing I wanted to share, a little brief introduction. In my lifetime in this community, there are very few Latinos and African Americans, people of color, who are very capable of reaching across the bridge, and we call the bridge the Mason-Dixon line in Omaha. Dr. Patrick is one of those individuals, and so I wanted him to share a lot about himself, how he's growing up, but also respond to a series of questions and issues that can help illuminate some of the challenges we face in these dark times dealing with this current administration, both nationally and locally. So Dr. Patrick Velasquez, welcome to Community Conversation on Critical Race Theories, and we'll be switching up and down on different issues as we go forward. So would you like to share with the viewing audience a little bit more about yourself?
Sure. Let me first say in Espanol, buenos dias or buenas tardes, depending on where you're at. Yeah, I was born in Omaha, Nebraska. My grandparents immigrated to Nebraska from central Mexico way back in the early 1900s. And my grandfather, Pedro Velasquez, was one of the first Mexican people, among the first Mexican families to settle in Omaha. And of course, most of the Mexicanos who came to Omaha in those days, like I think most of the African Americans, came to Omaha to work in the meatpacking industry. And so they settled in South Omaha, and that's where most of my family was raised. My mother wanted to get out of South Omaha just before I was born, so she and my dad moved to North Omaha, out in the area around Miller Park, for those that are familiar with North Omaha, close to 30th Street. And it was kind of a racially mixed neighborhood at that time. And I went to McMillan Junior High School for 3 years. I went to North High School for 3 years and graduated, and not really knowing anything about what I wanted to do with my life, and not really socially conscious at all. But fortunately, my older brother, 2 years older than me, was already going to college at UNO, University of Nebraska at Omaha. And so I followed him there and went for a couple of years without a major, and then ended up in social work. And through that social work major, I got involved with Chicano students on campus. We had an organization at the time called La Causa. And from there, I got involved in the South Omaha Chicano community. I was a volunteer with the Chicano Awareness Center, a very grassroots community organization, and moved up. I was on their board of directors for several years, and then eventually became the executive director of the CAC, as we used to call it. It's now called, I believe, the Latino Center of the Heartlands. Or
Midlands.
Yeah, I guess people got scared of the word Chicano there, and that was always an issue for us, but that's unfortunate. But yeah, that's a little bit about my background. I moved to San Diego in 1988, and after a while, I started working, shifted from a nonprofit community position to go into higher education. I'd always been interested in higher ed. And as Ajamal said, I think my graduate program or master's program in education helped me to get more in sync with the educational needs in communities of color. So I started working at the University of California at San Diego, which in retrospect has to be one of the most racist institutions in all of Southern California. It's a very elitist, classist, racist, Research One university. Very much a battleground where white people are trying to cling to their privilege and maintain a very elitist, prestigious institution all for themselves. People of color are trying to penetrate UCSD, as it's called. And so I was a part of that struggle for 28 years. And I've been retired now for 3 years, staying involved in the community and especially in issues dealing with higher education.
By the way, just a little backdrop. Tell me a little about the pictures in your background there. What's that all about? I noticed you got a number of wonderful pictures that you don't see in a lot of public places in this community.
Yeah, there's a couple you might be able to vaguely see at the top there that are in black and white. And those are pictures, old pictures from the Mexican Revolution of 1910. And some of our heroes that they never teach us about in school, even at the university level, people like Pancho Villa and Emiliano Zapata, I became aware of when I was in college. And so those are pictures documenting some of the Mexican Revolution. The colored pictures below are from Cuba, from some of my visits to Havana, Cuba.
Wow.
They have incredible art markets there. And so I purchased quite a few pieces of Cuban art. Most of them deal with Afro-Cuban percussion. I took up playing the conga drums about 20 years ago. And of course, Cuba is the heart and soul of Afro-Cuban percussion. And so that's been a great aspect of going to Cuba, but I wanted to bring back some of the art and have it on display here. Also, the music there in Cuba is just one manifestation of something maybe we can talk about a little bit later, which is the way that Cuba's been able to maintain African religions. And, you know, there was a time when I thought maybe the most progressive spiritual or religious pathway for Black people in the United States was Islam. But I've since learned that Islam came to Africa through an imperialistic colonial process too, and that it was imposed on indigenous African religions. So you don't find much of Islam in Cuba, but there is a lot of African religion still there. And again, it comes out in what some people would call the folkloric drumming there.
Wow, wow. One of the things that I wanted to also explore is some of your role that you played before you left Omaha with the Omaha Police Department. Also, I noticed you've done a number of articles on the Policy Research Innovative webpage that challenges the current status quo in the United States and so on in our community. And then also the issue I also wanted to maybe talk about a little bit is some of the future endeavors you might be working on or things you may encourage our community to deal with. But the first question is, what possessed you to move from Omaha to San Diego? And I know that was many years ago, but again, in hindsight, talk a little bit about what made that transition and make that a mecca or that transformation across the United States.
You know, it's interesting. I have been watching a series on cable television called The Chi, which is about a Black community in Chicago, South Chicago. And in one episode, one of the characters says something like, you know, Chicago gets a hold of you and it never lets you go. You can't get out. And to me, Omaha was very much like that as well. There's, I would say most all the people that I knew growing up and spending so much time in Omaha, you know, I lived in Omaha for over 30 years before I moved out here. And it seemed like most people never entertained the thought of ever leaving Omaha. And it wasn't that they were in love with Omaha, Nebraska. it was like for some reason they just couldn't envision any different place to live.
Right.
And I have to tell you, man, that some of my good friends, when I tried to move out here, told me, "You're not going to make it out there, man. You'll be back." And I said, "Well, maybe so, but I think there were some personal reasons, but I think also on a political level, you know, I really got tired of Omaha's conservatism,
Right.
and it wasn't the racism or the lack of diversity in the state. When I left Nebraska in 1988, the state was well over 90% white.
Hmm.
And even the city of Omaha, the most diverse city in the state, was also probably over 90% white. And man, that's a lot to fight against for a number of years. And, you know, just not to see your people represented anywhere. At the time that I left, you know, all my years, over 30 years in Omaha, I could count the number of Chicano doctors and lawyers that I knew on one hand easily. And so there didn't seem to be a pathway to any greater representation or empowerment for Chicanos in Omaha. And it wasn't just the white racism there. It was also the well, I guess what I would call the internalized colonialism of so many Hispanics in Omaha, including a lot of the older folks who ran organizations like the American GI Forum and the League of United Latin American Citizens. Some of the older Hispanic organizations in Omaha were very conservative, you know, and when some of us, like myself, wanted to confront the white political leadership of Nebraska and Omaha, these older Hispanics just, they didn't want to do any of that, man. It was like they were afraid of confrontation, and they wanted to be in the same room with these white policymakers, but just so, as Senator Ernie Chambers used to say, just so those white leaders could pet them on the head and tell them some Hispanic jokes and so forth. And that was really sad to see. You know, at a certain point, I said, you know, I have to get out of here, man. I can't deal with this anymore. And you know, Ajmal, one specific thing that I think was the breaking point for me was we had a very racist governor in Nebraska who posed as a pseudo-liberal named Bob Kerrey. And one of the things he did when he was governor of Nebraska was to try to eliminate the state Mexican-American Commission. And I tried to call him out. Some progressive Chicanos tried to call him out for that. When his tenure as governor ran out, you know, some of us sat around and said, man, if that guy ever runs for public office again, we're going to do everything we can to stop him. And sure enough, a few years later, he ran for the office of United States Senator. And when I saw some of this conservative element of the Hispanic community come out and support him after what he had done to our community as governor, I said, you know, to me, that's the last straw, man. I really can't deal with this anymore. So I started to look around. The process of how I got into San Diego is a whole nother long story, but I ended up here and have stayed here ever since. So contrary to what some folks told me, I didn't go back. I've been back to visit several times. I still have family and friends in Omaha. You know, when I go back, it's kind of a surreal experience. I was in Omaha almost exactly 2 years ago. And, you know, in some ways nothing's changed, but in other ways, it seems to have even gotten worse. So right. I'm certainly not, I have to say, I'm certainly not sorry that I left.
Right. In one of your recent essays you had on the policy research innovative, you talked more about your activism and the struggle with dealing with issues related to people of color. You also talked recently about the role of professional athletes. Why did you focus on them as opposed to politicians? I found it interesting how you laid that piece out.
You know, I've done a lot of writing and a lot of advocacy against public institutions for many, many years now. I'm also in the process of writing a memoir of my 28 years at UC San Diego. And actually one of my graduate school mentors here in San Diego, Dr. Alberto Ochoa, encouraged me to write this memoir because he said, man, Patrick, knowing you like I do, I can't believe that you worked at UCSD for 28 years without getting fired. And, I said, well, I came close a few times. You know, you said you're the master of probation. I think I was the master of verbal and written reprimands. I used to,
Chambers said when he went to Creighton University, they had his personnel or his file as a student was big as a telephone book. So it was a sign of a badge of honor. And one of the things I love to say is at Catholic Charities, I was on probation 3 times, promiseship 1 time. And it was always about principles and dealing with issues for our community. So again, you get used to it because they know if they let you go, they'd rather have you there than have you away because you would be kind of like dealing with them very severely. But yeah. Interesting.
Yeah, they didn't want to create a martyr out of me. And, you know, I had a lot of support from the students of color and alumni of color and some of the faculty of color there. So they didn't want to confront those forces if they had fired me. And
right,
so,
right.
But they had other ways of emasculating my work, you know, limiting what I could do. And they were very strategic and very savvy about that. But yeah, he told me, you know, you need to make that a written history so that other people of color in higher education can see how you negotiated that process for so many years and was able to make some changes without getting fired in the process. So I'm working on this memoir, which is very much about confronting public institutions. And something just touched me, I think, about the current struggle by athletes and especially what I see is a lot of the frustration on their part. You know, I've always, I said in the piece, you know, I've always been, or at least for a long time, very critical of people like Michael Jordan, Oscar de la Hoya, the Chicano boxer, and even LeBron James for not doing much more than they have to fight racism. And this notion that, like, I heard LeBron James say, well, you don't see what I do behind closed doors. And I said, man, other than going to the bathroom, I don't know what you do behind closed doors. And you're certainly not going to make any changes that way. Somebody with his voice and power needs to be much more visible and upfront about calling out racism. So right. I think we're seeing more of that in amongst professional athletes now, especially in the NBA. But again, I think the frustration that I'm seeing, it was as if, you know, they thought wearing these jerseys with slogans and putting Black Lives Matter in big letters on the court, that was going to stop white cops from murdering black people that are unarmed. And, you know, honestly, that's very naive, man. And so it struck me as, you know, this what I'm seeing is folks that have come to the struggle very late, unfortunately, because as you and I have talked before, the police murders of people of color, primarily blacks and Chicanos, this is not a new phenomenon by any means.
Well, it's part of the historical lynching in this country, and most people don't study that. There's been over 5,000, some will say 10,000 lynchings. And when you talk about those numbers of black and brown folks, majority have been African Americans, obviously, but the trauma that it creates in that family and it creates in that whole generation and so on. And so I see examples of that when I see some of my brothers come from the South and they're afraid to look white folks in the eye and challenge them. We got a few of those kind of folks around here. And my point is that trauma, whether it was historical or even current, it does a lot to a community. And again, that's part of the conversations we as African Americans and Latinos and Chicanos and people, indigenous, Native Americans, Asians need to talk about, because history is plain examples of that, the history that we know, not the history they teach in the public schools and particularly in these plantation educational institutions.
Right. And, you know, I think also our long history has shown us that law enforcement is not our ally. And we can go back, you know, the current phenomena that, of course, has been captured on cell phones and disseminated by social media is different. But I think back in our day and as we were getting started as activists, the real issue was the penetration of organizations of people of color by entities like the FBI.
Right.
And even the CIA. So we know what the FBI did to try to destroy the Black Panthers, what they did to try to destroy the Chicano movement in southern part of the United States. Close to where you and I grew up, man, what the FBI did to destroy the American Indian movement in South Dakota. And so the COINTELPRO program of the FBI under J. Edgar Hoover, what they did to try to subvert all kinds of progressive organizations of people of color. That's part of the history of what law enforcement, how law enforcement has served in the United States to increase racism and perpetuate white privilege.
Right.
It's not new.
You know, the other thing is you mentioned that even when I was teaching the Black Studies department, I was somewhat disappointed with the content of the curriculum because, for example, in Omaha, Nebraska, we don't have a book or an art. I mean, we don't have a class on Malcolm X. Malcolm X was born in Omaha, Nebraska, and you have a Black Studies department, but we can't even get 10 students to take that class. And then when we do have certain classes, and I'll use a couple examples, where they have some multicultural counseling classes, they have a public administration, they had some diversity classes, and they were taught by white women who've never been into North or South Omaha. And education, their greatest diversity teachers are white people who are inherently racist. I would even use the word genetically racist in the way they behave and act. University of Nebraska-Lincoln has a white guy who has a PhD, and he teaches Black studies or race studies, critical race theories, and he does it from a very Europe-centric white perspective. He doesn't have anybody to validate what he's saying, and lately they've been passing these artificial experts, and I use the experts just because he's got a PhD or he's got a master's degree or he read 4 or 5 books. If you're not involved in the struggle, I question your authenticity, or let's say I question your legitimacy as helping the people. How can you extrapolate or take from folks or appropriate is what they've been doing and do what they do and not engage or work with the very people? It's nothing but that paternalism stuff that we've been dealing with. So yeah, I'm disappointed in many of our ethnic and racial study programs at these universities. And as you alluded to earlier, some are more intelligent, supposedly intelligent, academicians or as they say, intelligentes, literally are on the payroll and looking the other way. And again, you can say that by the fact they don't even come into our communities or engage us, engage our communities on these important issues.
Yeah, that's a very powerful point. I think it's important to note that we are really in a different era right now when it comes to Black studies, Chicano studies, Native people studies, ethnic studies, because the people who are teaching it now are not like the people that we might have taken those courses from back in the day, who are not just scholars, but also activists. They really did enact that scholar activist model, and they were involved in struggles themselves. Whereas I think most of the people who are teaching ethnic studies type classes now, all they did was read about it. You know, they have not really been involved in any struggles, and they're not at the current time. And of course, in some quarters, those classes and departments have become more legitimized. And on one hand, that's a good thing. But what I've seen in California is that a lot of them have been co-opted by the institutions where they're housed. And so, I mean, this was a absolutely horrible problem at UC San Diego. And it remains a terrible problem in the sense that you no longer have ethnic studies faculty, at least not very many, that want to teach students about actually empowering communities.
Right.
So a lot of the faculty of ethnic studies programs have become what people call careerists. And all they care about is their career and trying to make more money, trying to get promotions. They're not concerned about community empowerment or about eradicating racism. And they would rather deal with, you know, the fringes of experiences in communities of color. You know, and what I've seen at UC San Diego, another thing is that even the vocabulary that's used by some of these so-called scholars, they've tried to develop their own complex vocabulary that about 5 people in the world can understand, and nobody in our actual communities of color can relate to. So the key example I see is here in California, primarily out of ethnic studies departments, they've developed this term Latinx instead of Latinos, or Chicken X, I guess, instead of Chicanos. And it's nonsense to me. It's idiocy, and they're trying to, you know, impose from the top down, from the ivory towers of higher education, impose these terms on grassroots communities of color. That a lot of us are not having it, you know. So that's a struggle that's going on, and it's really sad to see that you know, we have to battle against some of our people after fighting for years to get more African Americans and Chicanos into higher education. And unfortunately, some of them have chosen this other path.
You know, as you're alluding to that, one of the things that jumped out at me, and again, I will kind of apologize. Sometimes I do jump around a little bit, but one of the things that I found fascinating is the racism that is increasing more so, and particularly in this community. I mean, you see things, and one of the ways you measure is by the lack of diversity. You measure by the lack of economic parity. You measure by home ownership, and so on. And one of the questions I throw back at you a little bit, I know that you came to Omaha when you were invited to teach or lecture at Creighton University. I'm not sure if you went to UNO at some point, but when you came back and forth, how did they react to you when you say, you know, you're a native son of the community, you come back and you see the students? What was that like for you coming into Creighton or UNO, wherever you went, because you were familiar with them before you left, and then when you came back, what was it like in that academic environment as a Chicano professor or Chicano PhD person? What was that like for you, Pat?
I think it was about 7 years ago that I went to speak at Creighton University. And then I think about 3 years ago, I actually made a presentation as part of the Cinco de Mayo program at Metropolitan Community College in South Omaha. I did have a meeting with some administrators in the social work department and some other administrators at UNO that same time I was there to speak at Metro Community College. The presentations that I made were to an almost all Chicano audience. And you know, I had the feeling that people were listening and they heard what I said. It's hard to get a real strong feel for the degree to which I might have impacted them or at least made them think a little bit. One thing that I do remember is I said, you know, every time when I was at Metro College, I said, you know, every time I come to Omaha, I think about what a great influence Senator Ernie Chambers had on me. And that I think Omaha, Nebraska is so incredibly fortunate, especially the communities of color, to have Senator Chambers there all these years. Because he could have left Omaha and become a national spokesperson anywhere in the country, I think. To this day, I've never seen an African American or Chicano spokesperson on the national level that I think is wiser or better informed or just stronger than Senator Chambers. And I said, you know, I think Omaha is very fortunate to have Ernie Chambers here. This so happened there was a high-level white administrator from Metro College sitting at a table near the stage. And I think he almost fainted when I said that. I think he wanted to get up and leave. But, you know, so again, I don't think things have really changed much in Omaha since that time.
You know, I was going to run just quickly is Ernie, I talked to him years ago when I was at Metro doing some consultant work. He told me out of his mouth, from his mouth to my ears, he'd only been invited once at Metro in all these years. And then I was the second time making that happen, and he didn't have a great turnout. I noticed that they set the room up to have like maybe a couple of hundred folks there, and I think maybe only 10 or 15 showed up. And I found out later the director of publicity did not send out a press release. They sabotaged that whole event. Again, it's that racism that these folks have. And obviously she was from Lincoln, and I can call her name out. But how do you invite Senator Chambers to a community college where many of the students are working class students and never do the prep work to get the community there? And so again, it was for Neil, it was almost like that, you know, one hand rubbed the other hand, and that's how they operate in these racist institutions where they are kids coming through and getting brainwashed.
And you mentioned earlier about the inability of UNO to sustain a class on Malcolm X. Man, there should be a class on Senator Chambers. I can't tell you all the times that I've told people out here in San Diego about the things that he accomplished. How, as the only Black senator, the only senator of color in the state legislature, that he was able to bring about district elections for city council and for school board, which is something that San Diego doesn't even really have right now.
You serious?
Not at the overall level. You know, they've been easing into it, but there's still a lot of cities in the San Diego County area that don't have district elections. So,
Wow.
so yeah, I really hope that before he passes away, I would hope that somebody in Omaha begins to put together his biography and perhaps an autobiography so that he can speak for himself. But man, it would be a shame if his history is not documented. And, you know, unfortunately, he probably will not be appreciated fully until he does pass on. But
There
I
is,
hope that I hope he's appreciated and documented.
yeah, there is a book out, a PhD. She's now a professor. She wrote a kind of a historical piece about him, and she
Good,
published it as a book. And what's
good.
interesting, the framework of this book is more academic piece than it is a social piece. But she talks about how he played by the rules and more of a narrative of all the things he was involved in. So there's something out there, but I don't think as extensive as it could be. Dr. Patrick, I'm going to switch up if I can a little bit. And again, one of the things I want to come back to you, to this Fidel Castro and your role going to Cuba and so on. What was that like for you? And I do know that many of us who are conscious of Cuba and what they've done for the African countries and just how they've been able to push back against this imperialism, Western imperialism, have been able to maintain their culture. What was that like for you going from the United States to Cuba and interacting with people who are very much conscious of political, social justice stuff in the Northern Hemisphere? So what was that like for you?
You know, one of the things I would say at the outset, and a lot of people are for some reason surprised when I tell them this, but for all practical purposes, Cuba is a black country.
Oh, wow.
The majority of people there, at least, would be considered black if they were in the United States. And, you know, reading the research of people like Henry Louis Gates, there were more African slaves taken to Cuba than there were brought to the United States. So the African influence in Cuba is immense. I had been interested in Cuba since my days as a college undergraduate activist. And, you know, as Chicano activists, we always looked at Fidel Castro and Che Guevara and the other Cuban leaders of that time as role models of powerful Latin American leaders who would stand up to white racism and the imperialism of the United States. So I wanted to go there for a long time, and I've had the good fortune to have been there several times now. And you know, first of all, the Cuban people are very welcoming when it comes to folks like myself. There's a long-standing positive relationship between Mexico and Cuba that goes way back on several different levels. And there have also been Chicano activists since the 60s that have visited Cuba and tried to support Cuba in their struggle against US imperialism. So I found that people were very welcoming. They wanted to know more about the Chicano experience in the United States. There is a couple of programs there, academic programs that study Latinos in the United States. And so I was able to interact with Cuban scholars several times, and it was a great experience. You know, they're very well informed, very highly educated folks. And one of the things I was trying to focus on while there, as well as when I returned, was the education system of Cuba and how it stands alone in Latin America is a very effective system of education. Education is free in Cuba from preschool through professional school, very open access. So it's an incredible model, and the way that their education system addresses national identity and uses history to create solidarity among the Cuban people has been very impressive. So I just knew intuitively that there were some things about the Cuban experience that would be valuable lessons for Chicanos here in the United States. And that's what I tried to uncover and write about.
Yeah. You know, I fast forward to the Black Lives Matter and some of the killings of African Americans by racist police officers, so on and so on. And I want to go back to when you were in Omaha, you did some training with the Omaha Police Department. How is that different back when you did that training for many of these cops who treated you disrespectfully, you know, excuse me, many years ago, compared to what's going on today from your vantage point of looking at some of the craziness in our communities, particularly Minnesota and so on? Talk a little bit about that, and also your relationship with the Latino peace officers, because most people don't know about them in Omaha. What was that like?
Yeah, I think in around, excuse me, about 1986 or 87, I got involved with the Latino Peace Officers Association, which wasn't even an organization yet at the time. But I was approached when I was director of Chicano Awareness Center. I was approached by some of the Chicanos who were members of the Omaha Police Department, and they wanted our organization's support because they were dealing with discrimination against themselves as Chicanos within the police department. So I worked with them, and together, we formed a chapter of the Latino Peace Officers Association, which is a national organization. As I wrote in the piece about that, I'd had a very bad experience as a young man, 18 years old, getting beat up by some white cops in my neighborhood. And so I didn't have a very positive perception of cops in general when these Chicano police officers approached me, but they were members of the community. And I thought they were coming from a good place, so we did support them. I think by working with them, I did get much closer to the administration of the police department. And so I got to see more about what they were like. And then I ended up working with Dr. George Garrison, at that time the chair of the Black Studies Department at UNO, who was contracted by the police department to provide quote unquote sensitivity training. and talking about the history of police killings, this was right on the heels of two incidents in which unarmed black civilians were killed by police. So the community was outraged, and the police department decided, let's bring in some folks to do sensitivity training. So Dr. Garrison and I trained in total 500 police officers.
In Omaha, Nebraska?
Yes, from the top echelon of the department,
Wow.
the lieutenants, the captains, and so forth, all the way to the rank and file. So we did in classes, you could say, of 50 cops apiece, I think it was. So we did
50 cops apiece. I like that expression.
Yeah, we did 10 sessions, and we reached all 500 members of the police force. And that was quite an experience to sit there in a class, an academic setting, with all these cops in uniforms, and they had their guns, they had their mace, they had their billy clubs. And that was a very trippy experience, I would say, man. But also, and you know this because we did a lot of this together when I was there, man. I've done training sessions, if you will, with all kinds of people and all kinds of white folks during the time I was in Omaha, from professional social workers to university professors to school teachers to school administrators to elementary school kids. And I have never experienced so much resistance to cultural competence as I did working with those cops.
Wow.
And these are people who, of course, the hierarchy of the police department is very authoritarian. So they're used to taking orders and yes, sir, and so forth. But man, they didn't want to have anything to do with this sensitivity training. And they even they attacked us even with profanity at one point in the class.
In the class.
Yes. And the worst group of all were the top level administrators in the police department. They were the most resistant and confrontational as we were trying to provide this very academic content. It wasn't like we were in there pointing fingers or placing blame on people. This was an academic course, you could say. And the level of resistance was incredible. So I actually reached out to Senator Chambers when it was all done, and he worked with me, and we put on a press conference in which I told the public about what I had experienced, and that I thought the whole training was a waste of time, that was not a way in which you were going to effectively change police officers' behavior. They weren't going to change. And I remember at the press conference, Senator Chambers said, you can have all the training in the world, but if you don't have policies with consequences for cops that commit needless violence against people, then they're going to do it forever. If you don't begin to have consequences, including firing those cops and pressing criminal charges against them, then nothing will change. And that still resonates with me today because I think we're looking at ways to stop this problem, and it needs a hell of a lot more than just cultural competence training.
You know, it's almost ironic that one of the last bills that Senator Chambers sponsored deals with cultural competence or sensitivity training or basic race awareness for police officers, law enforcement. And basically you have to get at least 2 hours each year. But you would think the police departments or law enforcement in general, particularly the way they herd up many people of color and put them in the criminal justice system or whatever system, juvenile justice, they would be much more sensitive to some of the race issues, trauma, and the things that have impacted folks in our community. And instead, it's gotten worse. So I'm not sure what's going to come out of this bill. It actually was passed, I think, signed by the governor. But I suspect if it's anything like they do at UNO, where, you know, again, this white woman who told me she was walking down the hall one day. She had just graduated, and they let her teach cultural competency class, and she's never taught in her life. And then the other thing related to that is you have people who are teaching these classes. For example, Metro years ago, I had a course, a book on human relations related to, and it had a chapter on race issue or cultural diversity. Never used the word racism once. And so you got folks who are taking classes at Crate, UNO, and walking out feeling good and thinking that, you know, again, they have that manifest destiny mentality. And I suspect that's what's going to happen if you don't have hard-hitting people who've been impacted by the criminal justice, the juvenile justice system, speaking about their truth to power to these various entities. So it's going to be interesting to see what comes out of it. I'm not going to hold my breath because, again, the conditions we have today is part of a history of this country.
You know, I learned a lot from what I saw at UC San Diego in the way of policies that deal with sexual harassment, because white women in the United States have a great deal of power. And in institutions like UNO, they've been able to implement sexual harassment policies. Training is a part of that. So they have a very well-defined policy in what is sexual harassment and what happens to you if you violate the policy. And you can be fired for that. And then they train everyone, like you say, they require 2 hours of training every couple of years so that you cannot plead ignorance and say, well, I didn't know that was the policy.
Right.
So they train you, but that's only a small portion of it. Again, the policy is well defined. Violations face serious consequences, and that has really limited sexual harassment. So if you put some of those same principles in place in regard to police behavior where, yeah, that's fine, that's cool to give them cultural competency training, but again, there's got to be policy to define what racism is, what inappropriate enforcement and use of force is, and then there have to be policies with very serious consequences when they violate that.
Mm-hmm. You know, Patrick, one thing that comes to mind, and I'm going back to our childhood and, you know, coming through the level of adolescence and so on. Both of us graduated from high school in Omaha. You were at North High and I was at Central High. Central had it very much integrated for many years, but still had apartheid curriculum where you had the African Americans herd into those remedial courses, and you didn't have a really good Black studies class. You had one Black studies class, but it was apologists taught by apologists that about basically didn't deal with real substantive issues. But my question is, when you went to North High School back in the day, how did you become conscious of racial, or did that happen in high school? Because you alluded to it earlier, but did it provide you with a foundation of living in California or living with the Chicano experience? Did you get into that in high school? And what about college?
I think I saw some things in high school that probably were buried in my subconscious. I definitely was not conscious of them, but when I was a junior in 11th grade at Omaha North High School, we had some full-blown, people would call them race riots, where there were a massive breakout right in the hallways of fistfights between white and Black students. And I remember we had an all-school assembly, and the school gave, the administration gave some Black students a chance to get up and talk about, you know, Black history and the Black experience, and that they needed that in the high school curriculum. And that was the first time I ever heard anything like that. And I didn't resonate with me. I wasn't ready, I don't think, intellectually for it at that point. I was somewhere else. And, but I think it stayed there in my subconscious. And by the time I graduated from high school, I still didn't really have a social consciousness. And it's kind of miraculous when you consider the times. You know, again, as I wrote, the Vietnam War was still raging. I was looking at possibly being drafted and going overseas to fight against some people of color that had never done anything to my community. As Muhammad Ali said, no Viet Cong ever called, somebody a dirty Mexican, if I can do it. And so, I think little by little, the experiences began to accumulate, but it wasn't until I began to take some academic courses during my second year at UNO that I began to put the pieces together and realize that, you know what, for about 14 years, I've had a brainwashing education, I think as you used to call it, that the public schools made me think that, this Donald Trump doctrine that the United States is the greatest country on the face of the earth, the greatest country in human existence. And there was no such thing as racism or classism or anything like that. So, I think, coming to UNO and experiencing that other perspective was quite a shock. And it really pissed me off at first when I realized how brainwashed I was, and that the public schooling, Omaha public schools and so forth, were doing a total disservice to communities of color.
As you mentioned that, when I did my ed specialist degree, and again, I did a comparative analysis of the South African apartheid education for the Bantu and African folks and what happened in Omaha. And I remember my professors on my graduate committee were very angry and didn't like the fact that I made that comparison analysis. But what I did is the results were the same. Just like in the prison industry, you have a high percentage of African Americans and people of color in prison or in jail or the juvenile justice system, and they can't figure out how to stop making bank off our communities. And when you challenge it on them, they want to shoot the messenger. At the end of the day, there's an over-criminalization of people, and you obviously can see it through the data where you have sentencings where people giving longer terms, and stories and things that you hear from people where they're basically stopped or profiled because of the color of their skin. So again, our education system doesn't necessarily teach that. I'm going to switch up if I can, and I'm going to come back to something you said in one of your pieces I found fascinating. I think you've talked about it before, is this religion thing. Now, as a person who don't have a religious bone in my body, and I talk about that very seriously, that I don't have that. But you talk about your whole spirituality and what you were wrestling with growing up as a Chicano and dealing with Jesus Christ and white Christianity and so on. Talk to me more about that, because most of the Christians I know really don't do a good job of explaining race and that white Jesus image that is ramrod down African people's throat and make them pacify towards getting their social justice. So give me a little bit more about your analysis in that piece where you talked about how you've come to deal with the spirituality and race in a little bit different light than some of us who reject a lot of that spirituality that they talk about.
I think it started for me when I was still in Omaha, and I was the director of the Chicano Awareness Center. And we had several substance abuse programs, and one of them was run by a white woman, actually a Catholic nun, who I respected a lot. I still respect her, even though she's passed on, but she did a lot. I would say during my lifetime, I have personally met 2 or 3 white folks that really were courageous enough to confront racism without fear of the consequences for themselves. I say 2 or 3.
Wait. Let's see if we got that right. You say 2 or 3, because I assume you've met hundreds of people in your lifetime. You said only 3 or 2?
I've met thousands of people in my lifetime, but I'd say 2 or 3 white folks that I would describe as courageous in the face of.
Kind of like John Brown. Okay.
Yeah, exactly. And she was one of them, though. And she brought this to my attention, that there was a struggle in Chicano communities to try to bring more attention from the Catholic Church. And one manifestation of this was that example that Catholic social services had programs for alcoholism, to treat alcoholism in Omaha, but they didn't have any Spanish-speaking counselors. And they did not have services anywhere near the Chicano community. So I think it's pretty well known, especially in those days, that most Chicanos, the overwhelming majority of Chicanos, are Catholic. And, we get baptized into Catholicism, as I was. And then we remain Catholics without even thinking of other alternatives. But at a certain point, I think in the 1980s, some Chicanos were starting to leave the Catholic Church for other Christian denominations. And the Catholic archbishops of the United States wrote what was called a pastoral letter on Hispanics, I think in 1986. And they themselves admitted the neglect of Latinos by the Catholic Church. And so I remembered having some discussions with Sister Joyce about this. And with her assistance, we reached out to the local archdiocese, and we met with the diocesan chair. I don't remember what her title was. It was a Catholic nun, white woman who's a Catholic nun. And we said, hey, man, how come the Catholic Church is not providing social services geared to Chicanos? How come Catholic education is so expensive that it's not accessible to Chicano students? Why don't you have multicultural or bilingual education in Catholic schools? And man, dealing with this Catholic nun was exactly like dealing with the racist superintendent of the Omaha public schools. She had no empathy for what our agenda was and no intention of trying to create any positive change. So I thought, wow, okay, that's where we're at as, Chicano Catholics. And, when I moved to San Diego, one of the things I did fairly soon after I got here was to get involved with a small group of Chicanos who were very much focused on studying indigenous Mexican culture and religion. And in fact, they used to do what's called danza azteca, which is a folkloric Aztec dancing. And they brought me into the group. I played the drums for the group for about a year. And, I never thought about that before, about like, hey, man, like, I had read some books, one in particular by a Mexican anthropologist who was arguing that, there's a myth that Mexican people are mestizos, that we're Indian and Spanish. And he argued that if you really look at the cultural anthropology of Mexico, there's very little Spanish influence on Mexican people in terms of either blood or culture. That aside from the language and religion, admittedly that's very powerful, but most of the culture of Mexicans dates back to our indigenous ancestors. And he said that Mexican people are not mestizos, we're what he called de-Indianized Indians.
Mm.
And he suggested that the solutions to Mexico's problem do not lie in the models of Europe or the United States, but in the cultural foundations of the indigenous people of Mexico. Mm-hmm. And I never thought about this kind of alternative before, and especially what the religious or spiritual dimensions might be. And so that was, I think, swirling around inside for a long time. And then, as I said, going to Cuba and seeing how Cuba has made a very explicit attempt to maintain aspects of these indigenous African religions, and not just one, but several different African groups, because Cuba received slaves from several different parts of Africa, and each part of Africa had its own religion. And you still find those African religions to some degree, actually to a very large degree, thriving. I met some Cubans who told me, look, man, if you look at me, I'm light-skinned, I have green eyes, I have light hair, but I'm a member of an African religion here in Cuba.
Wow.
And I'm a practitioner of those African religions. And so that made me think, that, man, if Chicanos really want to be empowered, if we really want to be decolonized, how can we do it while we practice the religion of the white oppressor, which of course is Christianity? Right. How can we possibly do that? How does that contribute to our empowerment if we're using the religious model of the very people that are keeping us in a subordinate position? So, right. I don't know what the solution is. Some people say, well, Patrick, that's not practical, man. Like, you can't expect all of us Catholic Chicanos to go back and start, worshiping the ancient Aztec gods and the Mayan gods and so forth. And any more than we could say, let's stop speaking Spanish and start speaking the language of the Aztecs and the Maya and so forth. Yeah, it's probably not practical. It may not be feasible, but surely there are some things that we can extract from those cultural bases that would serve us better than trying to emulate the white man's models.
You know, as you mentioned, I'm reminded of Malcolm X, who one of his speeches, he said, you wonder when you pray to that white God why he don't answer you. And again, one of the things that I was teaching in the Black Studies department, I had a particular lecture on African religion. And oftentimes we use the term philosophy because there are many indigenous Africans who don't have either Islam or Christianity as part of the religion. They have a more of a spiritual, and some don't have any at all in a sense. It's more of a philosophy. And so when you look at John Mbiti and some of the books that he wrote about African religion, you see it completely different than these people who've gotten over here and they've gotten brainwashed with this docile slave religion. I didn't know until I started studying religion in the United States that when it first started for African folks, they had to have a white person in the room when they were praying to their white Jesus. And even today, I think one of the reasons why African Americans are in the position they are, as Malcolm would argue, is because they are being codified or qualified with something that has not served their interests. And again, you can believe in what you want, as Ernie likes to say, whatever floats your boat. But at the end of the day, I'm always looking for a Christian. You know, I mean, I see the stuff that they do to people, and sometimes it reminds me of that statement that someone purported that James Baldwin said. I hear what you're saying, but I see it's not what you're doing. And so when you look at Sunday morning and you look at Saturday mornings or whatever days you may go to your church, they're segregated, they're apartheid, and some of the things that people do under the guise of Christianity. Again, you wonder how can you be associated with people who don't practice what they preach, and so it's part of that agenda.
I mentioned in my piece on religion, spirituality, that I read a really good book by a Native American scholar named Vine Deloria called "God is Red," and he talks about a Native perspective on religion and spirituality. And one of the things that comes out of his work is the idea, which I believe, that white people have always had this incredible capacity to fragment their thinking and fragment their behavior. So apparently there was no contradiction when a white slave owner would go to church on Sunday morning and then come home from church and rape one of his slaves or beat one of his slaves.
Right.
And he apparently felt no contradiction in that. And so I think that's still maintained. Somebody told me once that a Christian is somebody who actually lives the life of Jesus Christ as it was described in the Bible. And I'm not sure I've ever met anybody like that in the United States.
Well, I make a joke somewhat, but it wasn't being facetious. But when I worked 25 years at Catholic Charities, I was busy trying to convert them. And they asked me sometime what was my job title. I told them I was a missionary. I was trying to bring them to Christ. So you get sit with a straight face, and you know that's how it runs. I want to ask you a question. I know that you talked a little bit about this issue of in one of your pieces, Open Veins of Latin America. And I remember the president of Venezuela gave a copy of that book to President Obama, and it shot up on the Amazon list. I had a chance to read that book and thought it was probably equivalent to How Europe Underdeveloped Africa by Dr. Rodney. And then there's another book written by Chancellor Williams, Destruction of Black Civilization. So as I read that book, it was almost equal in terms of what Europeans have done to Latin American countries and made them so difficult to deal with their own indigenous issues. That book seems like a powerful book. You think it'd be required reading for any person who's a Latino or a person who's concerned about people of color and oppressed people. Talk to me a little bit about that book a little bit, Patrick.
Yeah, I think I found out about it too when I saw the YouTube video of the president of Venezuela giving that book to Barack Obama. I think it's kind of funny, you know, when he got up to walk across the room and hand Obama the book, I think the Secret Service people in the room got ready to jump him.
Oh, he's going to do something, right?
Yeah, they became very nervous. But it's a very hard book to read. You know, if you have a social consciousness, you care about people's lives.
Now, when you say hard, give me a little bit more what you mean by hard. You mean academic hard or difficult to absorb the content? What do you mean by that?
Yeah, it triggers an emotional response when you see the brutality, just the unbelievable level of brutality committed by white people from Europe against all of Latin America. I think Galeano seems to cover every country in Latin America. And they all shared that experience, unfortunately. And so It's just a really painful book to get through. And but I think you're right. It's extremely important, you know. And I have never met a scholar of color in the United States that used that book
In the
in
classroom.
her curriculum. Yeah, and
Wow.
it's a wonder that it's not more widely utilized. But the striking thing, a lot of things striking about that book, but one of them is that as you read chapter after chapter, all these descriptions of white European conquest of Latin America and brutality and the theft and the exploitation of Latin America's natural resources, all the bad things that they did, all the brutality, all the theft, the Catholic Church was right there beside them at every step. And I remember, you know, I used to tell some of my undergraduate students here at the university that they would tell me, Patrick, I'm going to go study abroad in Europe. And I'd say, what do you want to go to Europe for? Aren't you really living in a European country here? And they would say, well, I want to see all the history in Europe. I said, you know, there's history everywhere. And they said, well, I want to see all the architecture in Europe. I said, you know how that architecture was built? Do you know where they got the wealth to construct all that architecture, especially all those Catholic churches, those temples and so forth? Man, that came from the rape of the natural resources of Africa and Latin America.
Right.
And so I think the book's graphic illustration of the role of the Catholic Church in all that oppression, which, by the way, still exists today. You know, I don't think in many ways that Latin America has been able to pull itself out of that, out of those situations. That's how powerful it was. And, you know, some people say, well, why is slavery still relevant? Well, it is. You know, if you don't understand the connection between slavery and the current socioeconomic conditions of Black people, you're not thinking very deeply.
Right.
And if you look at some of the dysfunctional conditions in Latin America, if you can't understand how European imperialism conditioned all that, then again, you're lacking a lot of important knowledge and you're not thinking about it deeply enough.
Right. You know, Patrick, one of the things that come to mind, I remember many of the meetings that you and I attend, we even helped start multicultural education, advocated in 1983. I remember that day we went to the school board meeting, and the reason I remember the day was the night my son was born, and in the morning after he had popped out and talked to me in his way as a baby infant, we went to a board meeting that morning and talked about creating the cultural diversity. And fast forward, and I know that in recent years, there's been this issue of Black-Brown coalition. UNO hired a couple of incompetent folks to do that, and they didn't do anything with it. Window dressing, they had some wine and cheese events and so on. And many of our youth and our families grew up in very difficult situations here on this apartheid city on the Hill. And my question to you is, how come we haven't, as people of color, both brown and Black, dealt with more unity? Our population in the city of Omaha is roughly about 33% people of color. We could determine the election of a mayor and a lot of folks if we join forces, but for the most part, entities have kept us from talking and learning about each other's respective history. So my question specifically is, how can we cannot get a united front as oppressed people of color, poor people, and so on, to change this hegemony of racism, elitism, and just outright subjugation that we see every day in our communities?
Well, first of all, we all know that there's nothing pathological about people of color or communities of color. So there's nothing inherently that blocks us from, crossing community lines to work with other communities that are situated the same as ours is. I think the reason why it doesn't happen more often is very complex to do, and we have a lot of powerful forces working against it. White society, the dominant society, offers a lot of incentives to people of color who will sell out and who will support the dominant culture and the racial hierarchy in society and the class hierarchy. Those kind of factors make it very difficult to achieve a real authentic degree of unity even within one community of color. So we could ask the same question: how come there's not more unity within the Black community or more unity within the Chicano community? And there's a lot more that we should, certainly we would want to see. But again, there's a lot of inducements to co-optation, to selling out, and a lot of diverse experience. Some people think that communities of color are monolithic, but they're not. Um, you know that there's a dimension within the Black community of folks that are not the descendants of slaves, that came as more from an immigrant background, like the father of Barack Obama.
Hmm.
We have the same phenomena in the Mexican community or the Chicano community. We have some folks like myself that are third generation Chicanos and others that just immigrated very recently. So, you have a lot of divergent experiences, and that leads to divergent perspectives. And, the other thing is that we tend to be, as communities of color, we tend to be working class people. And when people work all day, it's very difficult to organize and become a part of collective efforts outside of work. So there are a lot of racial and economic issues that I think stand in the way of coalitions. But, I think we need to keep trying. We need to keep trying both within our communities and, as you say, to bridge the gap with other communities of color. One area where I think it's natural to take place as our populations increase is in elected offices. So for example, here in California, we have a fairly good representation of people of color in the state legislature. And there is a Latino legislative caucus, a Black legislative caucus, and also an Asian American legislative caucus. And they have found common interests and been able to collaborate on some meaningful legislation. So, for example, we just had a bill passed within the last year that I honestly didn't think was going to make it, but it was a bill sponsored by Dr. Shirley Weber, a former Black Studies professor at San Diego State University, now serves in the state assembly in California. And she looked at what at that time when current law said about the level of force used by police officers and what they had to experience in order to justify the use of force. And so she made it more difficult for police officers to justify the killing of unarmed civilians. And of course, the police unions across the entire state fought against that legislation. But it passed and it was signed into law by our current governor. And we also had a law that she also sponsored, passed just recently, that makes ethnic studies mandatory in the California State University system for the first time. We have another one of her bills. She's very active and very progressive, and we have one of her bills coming up on the ballot in November in California that will restore the legality of affirmative action throughout the entire state of California, which has been outlawed since 1997. And so, this wouldn't happen without the coalitions of people of color in the legislature and then in the communities that are supporting that legislation. So the potential is definitely there.
One of the points, I want to jump to another point. The media does a great job of brainwashing our respective communities and people of color about many issues, and therefore alluding to what you said earlier. How do we reverse that situation, the stereotypical things that keep us somewhat divided, but how do we challenge the media or get our voices out there so that people can hear what we have to say?
I guess the answer is by any means necessary. The media is extremely important. One of the lessons I learned during an incident at UC San Diego was that racist institutions, and this is true of racist private businesses, they really don't like negative publicity. And so if you can get criticism of racism and specific institutions or businesses that are racist, if you can get those in the news on a consistent basis, you can use that to leverage some change. And when we had a series of racist incidents on our campus, the administration didn't want to make any change, but when they saw CNN, national news sources, international news sources coming into the campus asking about this racism and the image of the university as a racist institution going out across the entire country, then they began to take the issue seriously. And so somehow we've got to penetrate the media. Here in San Diego, I've been working a little bit with the San Diego Union Tribune. It might be exaggerating to say I'm working with them, but I'm trying to make sure at least that I submit writing to them on a fairly regular basis So they cannot say that, well, we don't print any letters written by Chicanos because none of them write. And, you know, we need to have our voices in the newspaper. The broadcast media is a hard one to crack, man. And I think what we used to do with public access TV in Omaha could be repeated perhaps here in San Diego. I don't see any of that taking place. I don't see any progressive voices of people of color. Honestly, after 30 years, I don't even know if we really have public access television. And certainly not where that gives people of color a real active role to play to express their voice. So it's very important. You know, we could talk for a long time about Spanish language media, most of which is controlled by white people, and how it just dulls the minds of Latinos with idiotic soap operas in Spanish and very, you know, the news is just these 10-second blurbs. You never get in depth coverage of any critical issues. So, man, we have so much work to do in the area of media, and obviously we need more people going into that field. But it's a tough profession to get into as well.
Good. Patrick, I'm gonna put you on hold. Somebody's at my door, but I'm gonna stop the recording.